Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. What do Muslims say when they pray? They say, La ilaha illa Allah wa Muhammad Rasul Allah. There is no God but God. Muhammad is his messenger. It's strikingly similar. Now, we pray 3 times a day. Muslims pray 5 times a day. We pray to Jerusalem, to the Temple Mount, where the gold dome is. That's the site of the temple and the Holy of Holies and the binding of Isaac's story. When Jews pray, that's the direction all Jews in the world are facing. We bow at the waist at certain points in the prayers. They bow flat out on the floor. We have kashrut, they have halal. We fast for 1 day on Yom Kippur, they fast for 30 days on Ramadan. Until today, 3,700 years ago is when that story basically takes place. It's not fair, I'm more dedicated.
Today on Inspiration for the Nation, we are joined with Rabbi Ken Spiro. For a year of my life, I would attend Rabbi Spiro's lectures in Aish, and he blew my mind. He has this approach that everything that occurs in the Torah is the script for what is to come in world history. He'll break down the origins of Islam, Christianity, and how the 2 big nations relate to the Jews. He'll also explain the source of anti-Semitism and why so many non-Jews hate the Jews. Whether you're an Orthodox Jew or a non-Jew watching this, prepare your mind to be blown as well. This episode is powered by the best clothing company in the world, Twillory, the #1 software development company, Bitbean, your ticket into Olam Haba, Smach Zevulun, and the top guy to help you find your next real estate purchase in Israel, AskTomer. This episode is in memory of Shimon David ben Yaakov Shleima and Miriam Sarabas Yaakov Moshe. Also, stick around for our big giveaway at the very end of this episode. Here we go. I'm Yaakov Langer, and you're listening to Inspiration for the Nation. Thank you very much, Rabbi Ken Spiro, joining all the way from Jerusalem for this conversation. And first off, what's it like in Israel right now?
Well, the weather's good. The politics and the neighbors aren't so good. I've been here a long time, and we're very used to this. Like, it's kind of been there, done that, although October 7th was a different level. So the shock was far greater. But now that we're going on so many months since then, more or less things have kind of returned to normal. We're coming up to a Memorial Day and Independence Day next week, which is Memorial Day is going to be very heavy this year. And Independence Day, no one's really going to feel like celebrating because we're still in the middle of it. We're still fighting. Unfortunately, soldiers are still being killed and injured, and we're not finished yet. And everyone's kind of holding their breath to see what's going to happen with Rafah, because pretty much everyone in the country more or less wants to keep going till we finish. Hamas cannot be allowed to exist in any shape or form when this is over. So it's a little bit, I think people, as we say in Yiddish, a little on spilkas. People are a little bit uneasy, but we're always optimistic here.
I hear that. So I would love to hone in. There's so much I would love to talk to you about, and I don't know if we'll be able to get everything in this episode, so maybe we'll have you back for a few other stuff. But I'd love for you to break down the origins of where Ishmael, where Muslims come from in the Bible, as well as where Christians come from in the Bible, and how that actually makes a difference to today.
Okay, so to begin with, you say come from, it's really important to define terms, Arab versus Islam, because Islam does begin as a religion of the Arabic-speaking people of the Arabian Peninsula. For those who don't know what that means, that's like Saudi Arabia, going back 1,300 years ago approximately. But it spreads all over the world. So while most Arabs are Muslims, there are Christian Arabs. Most Muslims aren't Arabs. Only 30% of Muslims are actually Arabs. The largest Islamic nation in the world is Indonesia. So, but if you want to go back to the origins of where it begins as the Arabic speaking Muslims, who are the original Muslims, their origins, obviously as a people, are the Arabian Peninsula. The Jewish take on the origins of the Arabs, and they actually agree on this. This is one of the things we do agree on, is that they're really our brother from another mother. That if you go all the way back to the story of Abraham, going back like 3,700 years ago, when his first wife, Sarah, is barren for a very long period of time, he takes a second wife, whose name is Hagar, who's an Egyptian princess. And from that relationship comes his actual first child, whose name is Ishmael or Yishmael. And he, in Jewish tradition, is the the progenitor of first Arabs and also Islam. And that, again, is one of the things we actually agree on. So both Arab Muslims and Jews venerate Abraham as our great-grandfather. Like I said, they're just a brother from another mother. So that's kind of the classic Jewish take on the topic. The origins of the Christian world is much broader because that comes from many different peoples. Christianity actually begins as an offshoot splinter sect of Judaism and only spreads to the pagan world later. So it has really no specific ethnic connection outside of the Jewish people. It spreads to a lot of different peoples throughout history will accept this as their faith. So, but the general Jewish take on the origins of the Christian world, which we consider to be more or less Western civilization, which America is also included in that. Judaism has a tradition that comes from, if we go a few generations later, we come to Abraham's second son through Sarah, who's Isaac. And Isaac marries Rebekah, and Rebekah has twins. And the first twin out of the womb is a guy by the name of Esau or Eisav. And Jewish tradition basically holds that Eisav is sort of the great-grandfather of what we'd call Edom and the Roman Empire. And the Roman Empire, as we call it, the Roman Catholic Church, is the great spreader of ultimately Christianity in the world. So they both, interestingly enough, have their roots going back in our tradition to two people who are very much connected to us. One is a half-brother and one is a twin from this, obviously the same mother. So there's a Jewish connection in both.
So what can we see in the Bible, in the Torah, that describes Ishmael and how they approach their religion today?
So when Ishmael is born, it's very interesting because Hagar, his mother, the Egyptian princess, was Abraham's second wife, she gets a little bit chutzpahdik, like she has a little bit arrogant with Sarah. Like, if you're so great, why didn't you get pregnant for so long? Look, I got pregnant right away. So Sarah demands Abraham throw her out of the house. And she's thrown out of the house pregnant, and an angel appears. It's a very interesting story. And the angel says, you're going to have a baby. It's actually very good. It says you're going to give birth to a boy, and his name is going to be Ishmael, which is an unusual story in the Bible. He's told in advance without the use of ultrasound. She knows what the gender is going to be. And he's also named in advance. And Ishmael, if you know what it means in Hebrew, it means God listens, which means because he's a son of Abraham, he has a certain level, as we'd say in Hebrew, protexia. He knows the right people. He's connected to God as a child of Abraham. He has certain merits. But there's also a really interesting idea in Judaism. It's called spiritual genetics. And this is something, I literally have an entire talk just on this topic, demonstrating that, today with the world is a big mushmash of different peoples. In America, it's a melting pot, literally, of different cultures. But if you go back thousands of years ago, nations were basically large extended families because most people were born, lived, and died for generations within the same area that their great-great-great-grandparents lived in. And not only did they share a kind of genetic common tree, all going back to the progenitors, the original father and mother, but there were also personality traits that were innate, like the genetics, the physical DNA. There's a spiritual DNA. It's a very basic concept in Judaism, which means if you were to go back to the world thousands of years ago, you'd bump into some guy on the street and you'd talk to him for a few minutes and you go, oh my God, he's such a Moabite, or like stop behaving like such an Ammonite or a Canaanite. So these nations have all disappeared. I mean, biologically they're in there, but they're no longer identifiable as separate nations. We, the Jewish people, for everyone who's Jewish, there's literally hundreds of non-Jews with Jewish blood, and anyone can join the Jewish people, but the core of who we are, we say, goes back to Abraham and Sarah, and therefore their traits are our traits collectively. Okay, with the caveat that every human being, like a snowflake, is somewhat different. There are certain Jewish personality traits, like radically transformative thinking, which is not limited to Jews, but it's very much a trait of the Jewish people from Abraham onward. Incredible drive. Jews are like the most driven people on the planet Earth. And also the caring. That's one of Abraham's traits, he was really into this idea of chesed, of caring. And you see, take any cause to make the world a better place in the last 150 years, any political ideology, communism, socialism, feminism, black civil rights, anti-apartheid, Doctors Without Borders, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International. It's usually founded by a Jew and today probably run by Jews because we love fixing the world. So these are like non-Jews can be into fixing the world. They can be driven. They can be radical, but Jews disproportionately have these traits. So too, we say with Ishmael, that he has a father who is Abraham, was the same father, the same progenitor as the Jewish people have, but he has different traits because his mother's different. And therefore, what's said about Abraham in the beginning of the Bible and Sarah is going to be sort of the encapsulation of the Jewish collective historical, spiritual, genetic personality. What's said about Ishmael is going to be basically the same thing. And what's said about it is very interesting. And it's not, I have to warn listeners in advance, it's not politically correct. But then again, reality is not politically correct. I always say if you want to be PC, no one gets offended, but you miss the truth and the facts. It says that he is going to be, the angel's describing to Hagar, he says he is going to be a Pere Adam. Pere Adam is a wild man. Now, what's interesting is the word order. For those listeners who know Hebrew, we know in English, when you talk about a noun and an adjective, the adjective comes before the noun. Take the word big boy. Big is the adjective, boy is the noun. So how would you say big boy in Hebrew? It's backwards. It's yeled, which is boy. Gadol is big. The word order is everything in the Bible is there for a reason. Pere is his essence. Adam is almost used as the adjective. We're talking about the essence of Ishmael is going to be a wild guy. He's wild. And then it has a very interesting, and then it says something very interesting. It says, Yad Kol Bo, his hand will be in everyone and everyone's hand will be in his. It's a very enigmatic statement. And if you look at what the great commentators like Rashi, the great medieval commentator, who was an absolute expert on biblical Hebrew, he says he's going to fight with everyone and everyone's going to be fighting with him, which is, again, not PC, but if you take Arab/Islam out of the picture, like what percentage of terrorism and conflicts in the world will disappear? You see a huge percentage of it. And if you go through the evolution of Islam, the fact that in their own theology and their own worldview, the notion of physical conquest of the world as basically exemplified through that word jihad is a fundamental part of the Arab worldview. Doesn't mean all Arabs are aggressive expansionists and trying to conquer the world, but is a part of the collective personal and historical experience of the Islamic world is this aggressive confrontational worldview. You certainly see it in the world today. Imagine if Iran, which is not Arab, because Persians, like Indonesians, these people are not Arabs, but they are Muslims. They've absorbed the ethos of that personality. They are basically the purveyors. The Iranians of today are the basically subsidizers, purveyors, and pushers of most of the terrorism in the world today. It's kind of a scary thought. Another interesting, just to throw in one more interesting comment, it says Onkelos, who's the Aramaic translator of the Bible. Aramaic was the language of the Middle East going back thousands of years ago. He's the grandnephew. He's a convert, the grandnephew of the Roman Emperor Titus. When he comes to this expression, and he's way before Rashi. Rashi, the commentator, is only 1,000 years ago. Onkelos, who's closer to 2,000 years ago, when he tries to explain what his hand will be in everyone, everyone's hand will be in his, he says he will need everyone and everyone will need him. So what does that mean? So it's the single best one sentence definition of oil, which has given the Arab Islamic world an incredible amount of money that they didn't work for, like a trust fund baby. They didn't work for it. Oil, money, and influence that they did not work for. And everyone needs them for their energy, their ability to supply energy to the world. But they don't produce really anything else. They need the world for everything else. So it's amazing how in a couple of sentences, it kind of encapsulates the origins of Arabs/Islam, because again, Islam is going to be a product of that Arab mind. And also the basic personality traits of the people who will descend from Ishmael's descendants, be they biological descendants or spiritual descendants in the future.
Folks, we'll be right back to this week's episode. But first, you heard us the other week talk about Smach Zevulun, and I've seen personally how many people are so obsessed with that. Jordan, tell us a little bit about Smach Zevulun.
Absolutely. Imagine having this chusum of a Torah giant on your shoulder. That's what we enable at Smach Zevulun. So while you're here working, your partner is diving into the depths of Torah, and you're earning all those chusim. There's a great source, the Gemara in Sanhedrin talks about the first thing that we're going to be judged upon is our limud Torah. And the Ramah then writes that based off of the Machabers, that if you are unable to spend the time learning Torah, spending all time in the base of Medrash all day, then you should provide for someone who is able to. And the Ramah then writes, then if you do such a thing, then those chusim are yours. And that's come out what Smach Zevulun is. That's what we enable at Smach Zevulun. It's an entirely new dimension of giving that's personal, that's a unique bond. One of the great stories that we've heard from people are, people have had amazing success in their businesses, from not being sure if they could afford a partnership, but taking the leap of faith to do so, and seeing incredible success in the number of bids that were being accepted, to getting new jobs with more money, to getting an inheritance. The way that this whole thing started is based off of the seed that was planted from a friend of mine who's a fellow venture capitalist who shared a great story about the partnership that he signed. It was for a lot of money, and he was very concerned if he should do it, if he should not do it. Ultimately, him and his wife decided to do it. He signed the shtar, and he was walking to the car with his Rav. And his Rav said, you have no idea how much bracha you're going to see from this. 12 hours later, he called me and he said, this was the craziest thing that ever happened to me. One of his earliest investments, a company called Honey, was purchased for $4 billion by PayPal. Obviously, Hashem has his own cheshbonos of how he works out everything for everybody to give them what they need. But these brachos we hear about every single time, I wouldn't even believe them. But because I'm hearing about it, we can write storybooks.
That's really amazing.
We're just helping people tap into this amazing bracha, this ancient partnership.
Okay, so someone who's watching is like, I'm in. I want to get involved. Tell us a little about what it takes to get involved and how they could reach you.
Absolutely. So we are open for anybody. Our service, we are completely free. This is a concierge level service that's completely for free. We take not a cent of anything that you give to your partners. The way that it works is you reach out to us. You go to www.smachzevulun.com, or you can WhatsApp us at 516-699-2095. And you'll get in touch. From there, we'll go ahead and we'll find you the right partner for you based off of what you're looking to gain out of the partnership. And then we'll set up your partnership. You'll sign the shtar. Partnerships today, most people come in at about $2,000 a month. And then, but it really starts to make it as accessible. The Das Torah has told us that the minimum amount is $1,500 a month. So anywhere in that spectrum, people are doing $3,600. Wherever you fit on that spectrum, we would love to have you. We would love to make this partnership happen for you.
So folks, you heard it here. If you want to help support not just one person, an entire family of people dedicating their lives to learning Torah and helping support a family.
100%.
This is it. Go to smachzevulun.com or click on the link in the show notes. Thanks so much, Jordan.
Thanks so much for having me.
Now back to this week's episode.
It's very fascinating. And I remember in one of your classes, you had this whole theme of how in the Torah, Ishmael's always kind of trying to outdo Isaac, Yitzchak. And I don't remember exactly, maybe you can remind me, like how in their mitzvos, you see that as well. Like they're always trying to outdo the Jews.
Right. That's very interesting, because if you go back to the Bible, it might be the word of God, but it still reflects the culture of the ancient Near East. For instance, property inheritance. Ishmael is the firstborn son. So firstborn son gets an extra inheritance, but he also should get the family business. And what's the family business of Abraham? Sure, he's a shepherd, but it's monotheism.org, .com, and .edu. And there's no indication in the text of the Bible that he's not a loyal monotheist. This is pre-formal Judaism. No Torah is given at this time. I call him a proto-monotheist, Abraham. And so he should get the family business, but God bypasses when Sarah gives birth at a very old age to Isaac, completely supernatural. There's a great lesson in that too about the creation and perpetuation of the Jewish people from its inception has always been miraculous. The fact that you and I'm sitting in Jerusalem in Israel and you're in Long Island, but that we're still here as Jews today is completely supernatural. But God, he says he doesn't have the right stuff, Ishmael. It's interesting. A little side point to understand all of this. What makes you Jewish is your mother, which is quite unique in the world. But you think about it, your mother gives you your essence, not to go into the details of reproduction, but the father's not too involved in that. His contribution is a couple of minutes. The mother then spends 9 months turning a single cell into a baby. The essence of who you are and your internal is the women represent in Judaism and metaphysical, spiritual level. They're the internal. The guy is the external. Like what tribe you're from, like what sports team. I'm a Yankees fan. That comes from dad. I'm from the tribe of Levi, from the tribe of Shimon. That comes from dad. But because Ishmael doesn't have the right stuff, because his mother is not Sarah, and all the men in that family will marry women from a specific family because they want to have that spiritual genetic combination that will create the people that will do the job. He doesn't have it. He's bypassed. So clearly, and he's also 13 years older than his younger brother Isaac, Ishmael is. So you can see very clearly somewhat from the text, but more from the midrashic stories, which is the rabbinic stories that add in a lot of details that are also based on the traditions that go all the way back to Mount Sinai, the midrashim, that he is very upset by the fact he's bypassed. It's not fair. So he's always feeling in his lifetime, and I would say this is kind of like in an epigenetic trauma kind of way transplanted through the Arab Islamic world to the present, that it's not fair, that they are loyal monotheists. There's a very famous midrash, which is a rabbinic story talking about how Ishmael is getting on Isaac's case because Isaac is circumcised at 8 days old, as Jewish boys are circumcised. By the way, interesting side point. In theory, Muslims are supposed to circumcise their kids at 13. I don't know any. I ask Arabs when they do it. They have all ways of not doing it then. When he's 13 months, when he's 13 weeks, when we take 13 one-year-olds, they have all these different ways of doing it, because I wouldn't want to try and go after my teenage son and do that to him. I could barely get him to take out the garbage, But he's basically getting on Isaac's case. He said, you did it at 8 days old. You didn't know what was happening. I did it at 13. I'm more dedicated. And Isaac responds in this midrash. He says, you're trying to impress me with just snipping off that? If God were to take my head off, I would gladly do it. They're arguing over who could be more dedicated. And what's very interesting, where that Rashi, the famous medieval commentator from France, brings this story down right before what's the next story? The binding of Isaac story. When God takes Isaac, his one son from Abraham, to, tradition says, Mount Moriah, with the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, to offer him up as a test. It doesn't happen. That story is very profound. There's lots to say about that one. But God sort of says, you open your mouth to your brother, your half-brother, let's see if you're really that dedicated. It's interesting. He clearly is, because it doesn't say God tests Isaac. It says God tests Abraham, the father. But so we see that rivalry carries on, and you see it all the way until today. Unlike Eisav, who's the progenitor of Western civilization and Christianity, who we could talk about later, who doesn't seem to be so spiritually dedicated and seems to be much more of a physical, materialistic, instant gratification kind of guy, Ishmael's descendants until today are very, very, very dedicated to God. And as you were pointing out when you're asking me the question, when I'm teaching this material, I give a lot of examples to illustrate the very close connection in many ways, not between Islam and Judaism, in terms of, because Islam, unlike Christianity, does have certain commandments, albeit there's 5 of them. And in also their worldview, they seem to be much more spiritually intense. For instance, we Jews, the fundamental watchword of Jewish faith is Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. What do Muslims say when they pray? They say, La ilaha illa Allah wa Muhammad Rasul Allah. There is no God but God. Muhammad is his messenger. It's strikingly similar. Now, we pray 3 times a day. Muslims pray 5 times a day. We pray to Jerusalem, to the Temple Mount, where the gold dome is. That's the site of the temple and the Holy of Holies and the binding of Isaac story. When Jews pray, that's the direction all Jews in the world are facing. Muslims pray towards Mecca. Before we pray, we wash our hands. They, though, wash their hands and their feet. We bow at the waist at certain points in the prayers. They bow flat out on the floor. We have kashrut, they have halal. We fast for 1 day on Yom Kippur, they fast for 30 days on Ramadan. We have, I always say we have laws of modesty, which they take to much greater extremes, a la Taliban, like put women basically in like sacks with eye holes. We taught the world dying for your belief. They blow up other people for theirs. Not saying all Muslims are doing this, obviously, but it reminds me that there's a musical called Annie Get Your Gun about Annie Oakley. And there's a song in the musical, is anything you can do, I can do better. I can do anything better than you. And it's almost as if the Islamic world is sort of saying, until today, 3,700 years ago is when that story basically takes place. It's not fair. I'm more dedicated. They're like the mirror image of us. And if a mirror image is interesting, because if I hold this cup in my left hand and look in a mirror, my right hand is holding the cup in the mirror. They're the reverse. So this is very much, I believe, until today, and I'm not the original person to say this, nor the only person who says this, but this is really what is driving their intense. And the problem is it tends to be it can be very fanatical, when Islam is definitely hijacked to the extreme, as the Iranians did and the Islamic world can do in history. Tends to give God kind of really bad name. People doing a lot of things in God's name that I think God would rather not have done in his name.
I want to talk about what happens in the end of the story in the Torah with Ishmael. But before we get there, I would love if you could break down, I guess, Eisav's contribution and Christianity and what you just did with Islam, of how that affects the brother of Yaakov, Jacob.
Right. So Eisav, we know, you have to fast forward a generation later. Isaac himself marries Rebekah. She gives birth to twins. The first one out is Eisav. Now, it's interesting with twins. I have identical twin girls. Twins I always, when I see twins, I say, who's older? They're really the same age, but one comes out first. And the older, by the way, the one who's out first is almost always the more dominant one, and almost always a little taller than their identical twin. I've noticed that. I've been checking this out many, including my twins. So he is out first, but this is a relationship that is much closer. These are not they have the same, they're not a brother from another mother. It's the same mother. It's Rebekah. So ultimately the rivalry there is much deeper, but they're very, very different. Eisav comes out, his name implies that he's made. Like it's interesting when Rebekah is pregnant, she's also barren for a very long time, and she finally goes to get a spiritual ultrasound from the descendants of Noah. You know, they didn't have modern, ultrasounds back then. And she gets this prophecy that there's two nations in your womb, and like the younger will dominate the older. And she's like probably thinking, I just want to know if the heartbeat's normal. Why are you freaking me out with this stuff? But she gets this whole prophecy thing, and then behold, she gives birth to twins. And the first one comes out, Eisav. His name implies in Hebrew that he's ready-made. He's a man of action. He's like, I always jokingly say, he's born with like a beard, driver's license, pickup truck, shotgun, and mud flaps, and he's a ready-to-go guy. And Jacob comes out like literally like holding his heel. He's like the follower. He's the more meek one, and he's described as Ish Tam Yoshev Ohelim. Tam it means simple, but it doesn't mean he's simple. It means he's pure. But he's kind of the professor guy with the eye patches on, like the Ivy League professor with the eye patches on his sleeves there, with the arm patches on his sleeves there. And it says that Eisav is a man of action. He's the kind of guy who's a natural leader of men, very charismatic. He's described as a great speaker. He's tzayed b'piv. He hunts with his mouth. Doesn't mean he's a vampire. It means that he's a really fast talker, which means that on a metaphysical level, he's probably the great grandfather of all lawyers and therefore all politicians. Whereas Jacob's just sitting in the tent and like reading books, probably Rebekah saying, put the scroll down, go play. So it seems in the story that the natural leader, he is the firstborn, just as Ishmael was. He should get the family business, monotheism.com, .org, and .edu. He seems like a leader. He's a great talker, but it's very clear, again, from hints in the text of the Bible and also from the Midrashic rabbinic literature, that he's not exactly what he's portraying himself to be. He's certainly not so spiritual. There's one story in the Bible, which is right there, which clearly indicates one day he comes in from a day of hunting, and he's like before lunch, and his blood sugar level is low and he's hypoglycemic. And his brother, Jacob, is making some lentil soup. And he says to his brother, give me some of the soup. And his brother says, okay, give me the firstborn birthright, which is kind of a pretty ridiculous deal. Who would pay? I always jokingly say, Eisav should say back, you kidding? I'm going to trade that for some parve lentil soup, at least have some meat in the stuff or something. And he does it. He sells it for nothing. And the language in the Bible is very truncated. And he ate and he got up and he left. And it says he despised the birthright. It's very clear, unlike Ishmael, who seems to be dedicated and seems to think it's not fair and really does want the job of spreading the idea of God to the world, Eisav is really not interested. He's just paying lip service to it. He's fooling his father. He doesn't fool his mother, by the way. Women always see things the fathers don't see. Rebekah sees right through what is going on. And he just wants his stuff. And you fast forward to the famous story where Isaac is old and blind. It's Rebekah who orchestrates the story of the stealing of the blessing. And what's going on in that story is really Isaac is old and blind. He wants to retire. He's going to pass on the family business to Eisav. And Jacob goes in dressed as his brother with the goat skin on his hands. I always ask, how hairy was Eisav? You ever seen a goat? The guy must have gone to like a bottle of shampoo every day or something. And he steals the blessing, which, by the way, Esau gets very upset because he thinks he's lost out on stuff. But you see clearly the difference between Esau's relationship with his full brother and Ishmael's relationship with his half brother. Ishmael is a very spiritually dedicated guy, albeit in a not necessarily the right traits to make him the guy to do the job. But Eisav really is just paying lip service to it. So you have, it's interesting, a repetition of the story of the younger, like basically getting something the older thought he deserved, but they're very different. And both of these, the half-brother Ishmael and the full brother Eisav, we say, harbor inside of themselves a lot of animus towards their brother for things, they feel they've been wronged, and they realize there's a certain level of competition, which will play out all the way till today in what Esau's descendants become, who in Jewish tradition becomes Edom. Edom becomes Rome, and Rome is the primary influence in the creation of what is Western civilization and the spread of Christianity in the world. And that, by the way, has been historically, certainly in the last 1,000 years, a much more transformative force in history than the Islamic world has been.
Very fascinating.
We'll be right back to this week's episode. But first, Tomer, you get a lot of calls with people asking you questions about real estate in Israel. Where's like the hottest places that people are looking to buy an apartment?
I tell you what, the hottest place everybody wants to be on top of the kotel, in the crevice.
Okay.
They're like, we want the kotel. And by the way, we have $1 million. And we want an apartment that is the size of a mansion that you would find probably in Muncie or some other Tom's River. That is unfortunately not the case. But a guy who's actually realistic and knows that he wants to either have a vacation home where he comes to visit once in a while, or they want to have a place to live in. So then you got to be realistic and figure out, okay, in Yerushalayim, Rechavia, Talbia, or the Mamila, that area, it's great. It's a good vibe. People want to be there. I want to be there, especially Sukkot. Everybody's there on Sukkot. So
I always say every Yontif is just magnified there. Sukkot, Hanukkah, Purim. It's not bad in America, but there's nothing like it.
There's
in
no
Israel.
better feeling than being in Israel during the holiday season, and the Rova and those places. So I've maintained connections and created new connections with developers, with private sellers. So we've got inventory in all these areas. And not only that, we have already people that started calling me, hey, I want to sell an apartment and I want to buy in another area, So Baruch Hashem, we created that incredible network,
right? Yeah,
where we could sell. But I have apartments in new developments, old developments, ready to move into, or things that are in Yupitzville, like Arad, in Tveria, Tzfat, different areas up in the north near Akko. Beautiful place, by the way, Akko. So whether you're just buying to move in or you're just buying to have a place where you could come and call it home, I have the place for you.
I think that's very beautiful. And I also think that sometimes, like, I'm not saying all, but sometimes when you're trying to deal with like Israeli agents, like they're upset and they're always in a rush. And I think it is a breeze to talk to you just in general. And I think when people are calling with these questions, they want someone who's going to hear them out and just help them understand the reality of it. And I think you did a good job at that.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. And I try to buffer that Israeli attitude where they will come to you and tell you, no, you can't come. You can't do this, can't do that. And I'm like, guys, just relax. Let me handle the transaction. I will make sure that they're happy. The American needs to be pampered. It's just the nature of it. They don't want to have to deal with the bureaucracy. There's a lot of stuff going on. You would not want to know what's going on, but I buffer that out for you.
Beautiful. Okay, so AskTomer.com, the link in the show notes. If you have any real estate questions, if you even have a Havamina to buy something in Israel, go ahead and give Tomer a call today.
From the end of the story in the Bible of what happens, could you take us through what happens with Ishmael and how, I guess, he comes back and does tshuva, and Esav's ending off with Yaakov of like, I'll meet you in the future or something like that.
Right. So Ishmael kind of goes off and becomes an archer, and he's somewhere out in the Arabian desert. It doesn't say much about him at all, as a matter of fact. There's a lot of midrashic stories about this, a lot of rabbinic stories filling in details about the relationship between Abraham and Ishmael and what happens, and he tries to visit him. But what is interesting, what the Torah says when Abraham does pass away, it says that Isaac and Ishmael buried Abraham. And again, since there's no accidents and every word and every letter is there for a reason, the rabbis jump on the word order. the fact that Isaac, who is the second born half brother, is mentioned first shows that, first of all, it's sort of like setting the stage for what will happen in the future. Just as when Abraham dies, Ishmael kind of recognizes that even though I'm older, you are really the family leader of the monotheism.org.com and .edu business. So he takes second place in that relationship, which the rabbis extrapolate out from that, by the way, that in the future, in the redemption, as much as Arab Islamic world is really in our face now, literally our closest neighbors, me sitting here in Jerusalem, but also who's fighting us today? Who's the tip of the spear leading all the activism on the campuses of all the screaming, people about the end apartheid and internet, and basically globalize the intifada. It's all of these, Muslim wearing keffiyeh guys. But the idea is that really, because they are kind of closer spiritually in the end of days, messianic redemption scenario, they actually line up behind us first. I know it sounds kind of counterintuitive, but that seems to be what the Jewish tradition is implying. With Eisav, it's interesting that when Jacob steals the blessing, he has to literally flee for his life because Esau, his half brother, says, as soon as my father's dead, I'm going to kill my brother. And he goes back to Haran, to Turkey, to live with his mother's brother, Lavan. His name is, which translates to White. I always say, never trust anyone named Mr. White. He's like the biggest crook in the Bible. Interesting side point that Jacob, who's described as being very pure and straight and not naturally a deceptive person like his brother, has to deal with the two most deceptive people in the Bible. One is his brother and one is his uncle, both of whom are really trying to always take advantage of him. And he outsmarts them both. This becomes a pattern for the Jewish people who've had to, throughout history, live, especially in diaspora, with all kinds of restrictions and ghettos and special taxes and limitations. As Mark Twain says beautifully, the Jews made a marvelous fight in every generation, and he's done it with his hands tied behind him. We've always made the best of the worst and always managed to often outdo the people who are trying to keep us under their thumb and down. But he goes to live with his brother, and he marries two sisters, and he takes two more wives who are their maidservants, and he's successful despite the efforts of his father-in-law to keep him down. He accrues tremendous wealth. He builds up a huge family of, he has 12 sons and at least one daughter that's mentioned specifically. Again, everything here is a pattern for the future. Everything is. But he's told the only future for the Jewish people is the land of Israel. And that, by the way, is very relevant to today. There is no end game for Jews living in diaspora. There's only Jews who live in Israel and Jews who will be living in Israel. There is no long term, and long term in Judaism can be very long. We're approaching the end of that now, in my opinion. We all got to come back to here. And he realizes that he's got to fulfill his mission, because we're a very unique nation, like a unique plug that only plugs into one outlet where it can work. The only outlet we can plug into as a people to fulfill our unique destiny is the nation that's a light to nations, is Israel. So he packs up his family, his kids, the camels, the stuff, and he heads back to be reunited with his brother he hasn't seen now in 22 years. The expression, time dulls all pain, except when it comes to Eisav. Because Esau comes out to meet him with 400 men, like cavalry. That's as many cavalry as a Roman legion has. And Jacob pursues the famous three-pronged strategy we're all supposed to learn from as Jews and really as human beings. First of all, he pursues diplomatic initiative, sends his brother gifts, knowing he loves stuff. He's sending him flat screen TVs, the latest iPhone, a Bugatti, whatever he's sending the guy. He prepares to fight. As the Romans would say, sivi pacem pari bellum. If you want peace, prepare for war. And he prays, because God runs the world, but you got to make maximum effort. And they're reunited. And what happens is these interesting dots, they hug and they kiss, and these really strange dots appear in the text of the Torah. And again, the commentators are going wild on this stuff. And it's basically, to make the very long story short, it's very clear that Esau still bears a big grudge and is very angry. As a matter of fact, Rashi jumps in, the famous medieval commentator, and he says, Omer Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai is who lived 1800 years ago. And when hiding in a cave from Esau's descendants, the Romans, because they wanted to kill him, he writes that great book of Jewish mysticism called the Zohar. He's one of the great mystical thinkers of all of Jewish history. He says, so he knows Esau's descendants very well. He says, Omar Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai says, Halacha hi biyadua. It's a law that Eisav sonet Yaakov, that Eisav hates Jacob. It's like in his spiritual DNA, like he's suffering from this epigenetic trauma and anger. He's always suppressed a lot of times. In this particular case, in the reunification of the two brothers, it's overwhelmed by the emotions of the moment of not seeing his twin brother in 22 years, but he's still really angry at him. And that's the driving force we see on a very deep level behind a lot of the hatred that follows us through today, that comes from the descendants of Esau, Christianity, Western Europe. But what Esau offers his brother, he says, come with me to Mount Seir. Like, that's where he lives. He's living in his own place in Edom land, and we'll go into business together. I always jokingly, half jokingly say, imagine if that had really happened. Imagine if the Roman Empire had a Jewish CEO and a Jewish chief financial officer, even better yet. They'd probably still be in business and making a profit. But Jacob realized, I can't live with him. You know, you live in a bad neighborhood with people who have kids who are messed up. It's going to mess up your kids. But he can't tell them that. So he's very obsequious and fawning. He says, no, Yavo and I, you go on ahead and my master. He's always saying my master. He's always being very deferential to him. I'll catch up later. So again, Rashi, the great medieval commentator, who's always answering the most obvious question you should be asking if you're actually thinking when you're reading the text. Rashi knows that we've read the Bible a lot, and we know that Jacob never goes to live with Eisav, and he's just trying to get rid of him. But if whatever comes out of his mouth has to happen at some time in the future. So Rashi asks, when will Jacob go to live with Eisav? Go to live with Esau? And then he quotes Ovadia. Ovadia is the smallest book of the prophets. He's a convert who gets one chapter. And Ovadia says, Va'alu Moshim lahar Tzion lishpot hetar Eisav. And a redeemer will go forth from Zion to judge the mountain of Eisav. And what's Ovadia the prophet talking about, going back about 2,700 years ago? He's talking about the Messianic era. And he says, eventually, only when, and the Talmud in Tractate Sanhedrin jumps in and says, this is one of those pivotal moments in all of Jewish history and human history. Jacob and Esau, as twins, are supposed to walk together in history as equals. When Jacob says to Esau, you go on ahead, I'll catch up later, it's the Jewish people saying to Esau, saying to Edom, saying to Rome, saying to Western civilization, you're an instant gratification people. You're not going to be able to wait for this. And you want stuff. We like stuff too as Jews, but we're really spiritual. Our mission is spiritual. It's moral. It's ethical. It's transcendent. That's not your thing. You go get your stuff, build your empire, conquer the world, get your wealth. But in the end, even you, my brother who came out before I did, will recognize ultimately, just as Ishmael does with Isaac, that I am really the firstborn, even though I didn't come out first. And that you're supposed to follow my lead, which is the Jewish vision of chosen people and our responsibility throughout history, which is not to conquer the world. I always say the only Jewish empire in history has been Hollywood, complete creation of Jews and not a source of Jewish values. And it's not to convert. We make it hard to convert to Judaism. It's to be the role model, to show the world how to do it right, to be the light to the nations. And that's the job. And eventually we say the world, when they stop pushing back against that, which is what drives anti-Semitism, all anti-Semitism ultimately is a pushback against that. Eventually they will say, all right, you're right, and show us how to do it right.
We'll be right back. But first, I need to issue an apology. Last week, I mistakenly said that Bitbean charges for their first consultation. Well, that was fake news because they actually charge $0 to meet with you. Yes, you heard me right. And this week, we're diving into the world of business ideas and startups. If you have a vision for a new venture, whether it's the next Uber, Airbnb, or any groundbreaking tech business, Bitbean is here to help you bring that idea to life. Up until now, you heard how Bitbean can scale your existing businesses, and that's still true. But today, we want to reach out to those of you who are at the very beginning of your entrepreneurial journey. Starting a tech business is not a small feat. It involves hiring talent, designing the product, developing the technology, and managing the project from start to finish. This is where Bitbean comes in. At Bitbean, they have all the resources you need in-house: designers, product developers, project managers, and developers. They're equipped to handle your startup idea comprehensively, guiding you through each step of the process. It's important to recognize that creating a technology business is a major endeavor. It's not just about having a great idea. It's about being ready to invest in time, effort, and resources into making it a reality. So, if you're ready to take the plunge and turn your innovative idea into a successful business, reach out to Bitbean. Get excited to transform your vision into reality with Bitbean. Now, before we get back to this week's episode, I'll make this message short. I'm wearing Twillory's vest right now. A vest? Yes, a vest. Deal with it. It's actually really clutch because I keep my keys and wallet in there. And don't worry, I only have kosher money in my wallet. It helps me not lose my things because that would be an issue. If you're serious about getting the coziest pants, shirts, polos, socks, undershirts, and suits, and vests, then you'll love Twillory. Use code INSPIRE for $18 off at checkout. Warning, you will revolutionize your wardrobe. And if you're married, your wife's going to be like, you have to only wear Twillory because this is the best clothing. You look great in it. And my wife's very happy with Twillory. So thank you, Twillory. Now back to this week's episode.
I would love to kind of, I guess, end off on that topic of the driving force for anti-Semitism. Like, what's really behind that?
Wow, nothing like a nice, short, easy question to answer.
I know. I know you could go on like 10 hours.
Yeah, this is the topic
but,
you should know, by the way, that everyone wants to hear about now. Like I'm a tour guide also, and I haven't not a lot of tour guiding to do in Israel, but I've been going a lot of speaking tours around the world. And, I say on October 7th, we in Israel got a big bucket of ice water in our face. Shocking. And the whole Jewish world, the levels of anti-Semitism are going through the roof. And everyone, even Jews who are very disconnected, are like, why are they coming after me? I'm not so Jewish. But to make the really long story short, the simple answer to that question, you think about it, if you study the history of anti-Semitism, we're accused of a lot of stuff. Just to run through like a short list of what we've been accused of in the last couple thousand years. Let's see, we killed God's son. We kidnapped Christian babies, used their blood to bake matzah. We brought the Black Death to Europe. We poisoned wells. We're in league with the devil. We control the world's economy, seismic activities, solar flares. We trigger tsunamis in Southeast Asia to drown Indonesia with tidal waves, release sharks into the Red Sea to destroy Egyptian tourism. We send vultures to spy on Turkey and Saudi Arabia. We stole Iran's cloud cover. We have a space laser. I mean, think about it. Yaakov, if the world believed even 10% of that stuff, no one would mess with us. Would you mess with people who control the weather, the animal kingdom, the economy, and have a space laser? Clearly. Now, a lot of people believe a lot of stupid things about us. But bottom line is, the simple answer is we have, from the time of Abraham onward, been schlepping the world, dragging the world, often very reluctantly, towards a vision of values based on one God and one absolute standard of reality. Because Judaism understands that the purpose of creation, an infinite being creates a world to give, to have relationship with that world. And all of creation ultimately is about connection to God. Not that God needs anything from us, but we're trying to get the world to quote the rabbis Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young in that great song, Deja Vu. We're trying to get him back to the garden. And anti-Semitism, regardless of whatever excuse it hides behind, is always, even though most people believe the stupid excuses, but in the deepest, off a subliminal level, is always a rebellion against the national historic mission of the Jewish people. And very few people will say it like it is and openly. Interestingly enough, one of the people who says it most openly is Adolf Hitler. And I know, how would you quote Hitler talking about Jews? Usually you don't want to quote a guy wearing a white hood with eye holes burning a cross outside a Black Baptist church on what he thinks of black people, because he's obviously not going to be too objective. But sometimes the people that hate us the most get us the best. And Hitler says something very interesting. He says the Jews put two scars on humanity, conscience on the soul and circumcision on the body. And they're both Jewish inventions, which is wow. That's the greatest backhanded compliment ever given to the Jewish people. And I always say even better than that, just to give one more example. If you look at the words, this is not a quote from Hitler. This is the words of the Hitler Youth song. This is the song that, Hitler gets to power in 1933. He creates his German Nazi youth movement called the Hitler Youth that everyone belongs to. And they had a song, and this is not the words in German. It's the translation in English. This is every kid in Germany is singing this song from 1933 to 1945. Listen to the last 7 words of the song. I hold that it is not only the 7 most important words. Yesterday was Holocaust Memorial Day in Israel. Yet it's not only the 7 most important words, I believe, to understand what drove Hitler in the Holocaust. It's the 7 most important words to understand ultimately what drives all of anti-Semitism in human history, all excuses aside. And it goes like this. We are the joyous Hitler Youth. We don't need any Christian virtue. Our leader, meaning Hitler, is our savior. The Pope and rabbis shall be gone. We want to be pagans once again. Wow. That's unbelievable. It's not even, it's right out there. We don't want any of your ethical monotheism, any of your 10 commandments morality. We want to just be free to be natural and animalistic. That's the way the world used to be. And that's really important to see, because then we understand what it's really about. We don't get distracted by all of these, bait and switch excuses that never solve anti-Semitism. Whatever shape we change ourselves into, you hate me because I'm different, I'll become just like you. And then they hate us for being just like them. You hate me, we'll live in the diaspora, so I go live my own homeland. Now they say, go back to Poland. because this is all we're being told, that none of this has to do with what's really going on. And this is very empowering for us, because Rabbi Chaim of Volozhin, one of the great early 19th century rabbis, he summed it up in one sentence, the single best explanation for anti-Semitism. He said, when Jews don't make Kiddush, Gentiles make Havdalah. And we know on Friday night, we go from the lower workday week to the higher spiritual level. And Shabbat is just a different level of reality. You make Kiddush, you make a special blessing on a cup of wine. It's called Kiddush. It's made on a cup of wine. And on Saturday night, at the other side of that day, when we're going down to the normal lower level, also on a cup of wine, you make what's called Havdalah. Rav Chaim of Volozhin is not meaning it literally. He says when we don't do what our job as Jews is, and our job of Jewish people is not to learn Torah and do mitzvot, that's a means to an end. That's the software, the payload, the rocket fuel, the guidance system of the Jewish people. There's no Judaism. There's no perpetuation. There's no connection to Judaism without that Torah and the commandments that go with it. But our job as the God Squad is Kiddush Hashem, to live and act in a way that inspires other people. When we do not directly or indirectly fill the world with the values that we got from God, the value of life, peace, equal justice, proactive social responsibility, universal education, these all come from the Jewish people. They do not come from other cultures. When we don't fill the world with those values, the opposite values fill the world. The opposite values are evil. And when evil comes into the world, the first people it's going to target are Jews, and the first country it's going to target is Israel. And you can literally test how countries have done throughout history until today by how they treat their Jews. A country that treats Jews well is generally a normal, stable, liberal, democratic country. A country where Jews are persecuted or starting to be persecuted is a country that's moving towards totalitarianism or is already there, because we're the canary in the coal mine. We get it first. And why non-Jews should be concerned about this? Because it's going to start with us, but it's going to spread to everyone else. And George Gilder, in his book, The Israel Test, which is a fantastic book, he says, just as Jews within a country are the measure of that country's morality, Israel, the state, is the Jew amongst the nations. Show me what a country thinks of Israel, and I'll show you exactly where they're holding. You think it's an accident that Iran, North Korea, Cuba, Venezuela, they hate Israel? We are always in the crosshairs of evil. But it's very clear. The message is we have to stop being reactive and be proactive and be reunified and be Jews for Judaism. And Jews for Judaism make incredibly good. Not that all Jews are amazing people. There's righteous Gentiles and there's rotten Jews in this world. But generally speaking, as a rule, Jews for Judaism make the absolute best role models for the human race. We have given humanity through offshoot faiths or through the creation of modern liberal democracy, which is overwhelmingly based on Jewish values. It says it right in the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. We are the most, for our we may be 0.2% of the world's population, but we are collectively, historically, have been the most transformative force in all of human history. And until we finish that job, going back to what we started with, these offshoots, Islam and Christianity and Western civilization, whatever, there's going to be pushback against us, because that's the pressure that has to be put on us to finish the job. Because until we finish that job, there's not going to be peace for Israel and anti-Semitism until we get that done. And I know it sounds like the impossible dream, but as the first prime minister of Israel, David Ben-Gurion, who was not religious, he said it beautifully. He said, to be a realist as a Jew, you got to believe in miracles. And it really is all supernatural if you stand back and look at it.
Wow, there's so much here, and I have a trillion questions, but we can't make this too long. I want to ask you, right before we finish off, what's your prediction? What's going to be happening in the next few months with what's going on? What's going to happen within the next 5 years? And what's going to happen the next 20 years?
Well, first, I'm not a prophet. I always say, if weathermen were prophets, they'd be working in Wall Street. You know?
But you know what? You're a historian, so
right.
You could look at the data and you could say, okay, based on the data, again, you're not a Navi, you're not a prophet, but your guess is better than mine. That's for sure. Because
there's a general idea. All my teaching is based on the notion that the actions of the fathers, it's a famous quote from Nachmanides, the great medieval Jewish rabbi, that which happens in the Bible is the revealed pattern for everything that comes later. And since we introduced the concept of determinism into human history, that there's a director, producer to the story, God, and that human history is a control process leading to an end. We are in his story. That's why it's called history. We play, every human being's in the story. We just play kind of a central role despite our teeny tiny size. So given that we understand the parameters and what the plot is basically about, it's all about humanity ultimately returning to God and the Jewish people leading the way. Clearly, in my mind, what I can say without giving specific dates, and I don't know what's going to happen with Gaza and etc., the pressure, it's pretty clear to me that God is kind of like, okay, guys, enough already. We've been schlepping this out way too long. This should have ended a long time ago. And you guys are tearing each other apart. And look at how the world is ripping itself apart. Look at how the extremes in either direction, that there's no middle anymore. Look at politics in America. You have the squad on one side and the MAGA guys on the other. There's no middle ground. The Jewish world also, there's two extremes, very left-wing secular Jews and fanatically religious right-wing Jews. And if it's happening in our world, it's going to be reflected by the world at large. That's always going to be the case. But it's pretty clear to me that the big guy upstairs is saying, I've had enough. We need to end the story, which is why, in my opinion, the rabbis always refer to, and I know men should never talk about women giving birth because we never do that. I once had a kidney stone, which is the only reason why I dare comment on this, because I've been told it's the closest thing a guy will ever get to feeling like what it's like to give birth. But it's always referred to as the birth pangs of the Messiah. And when a woman is about to give birth, she has contractions, and the contractions come closer together and get more and more intense. It can be very difficult, and births can be very complicated and difficult, or they could, relatively speaking, be smooth. All of human history is an interplay between our free will and the mistakes and stupid doings we do as Jewish people and humanity, and God's infinite knowledge and control. So, one way or another, we get to the end of the story, but it's based on decisions we make. It's like we can do this the long way or the short way, the hard way or the easy way. We can have the emergency C-section or the pretty smooth, relatively painless delivery. And in the end, you get a beautiful baby. It always ends well. But that, in my opinion, what's going on now. We are in what's called the birth pangs of the Messiah. And unfortunately, it looks pretty clear to me that God is inducing the pregnancy, the delivery. He's really turning up. Things are moving because everything closer and closer together, more and more intense. That is very clear to me what's happening now. So the specifics, I don't know. But even though things in Israel might become a little more normal, it never goes back to the same level. It goes up. And when it comes down, up, down. So we're getting higher and higher. So I think personally, we're very close. Honestly, there's things happening. It's like the famous analogy of the frog sitting in the bucket of cold water put on the stove and the heat is turned on. The frog boils to death before it realizes that the water's that hot. So I'm not saying we're going to boil to death, but clearly things like you look in America, the amount of security and what's going on in the anti-Semitism, and you get used to what was considered completely abnormal even a decade ago is now considered normal. And all of us in the Jewish world and the world in general, we're all being put in a position where we're being made much more uncomfortable. Not just about Israel and the Middle East, but just in general, how the world is ripping itself apart, how there's no middle ground, how truth seems to be absent, how people are fighting over biological realities. The world's really going nuts. And ultimately, we Jews believe that everything that is true on a physical or metaphysical level ultimately has to go back to God. Emanates from God, and it's our job to bring humanity back to that for the sake of not us, but for the whole human race. So I think we're getting to that very, very soon. Very soon. I think it's going to be very shocking. I think that's definitely what's happening.
Okay, Rabbi Spiro, thank you so much for taking your time to do this. I apologize for me sounding like RFK because I just lost my voice and I can barely get anything out.
That's exactly what you sound like.
I finally feel bad for the guy. I'm like, okay, this is what it feels like to try to talk, not be able to talk, and yeah. So, but thank God that you were able to talk, and I really appreciate you coming on. Is there anywhere, a website or a tour or a book or a speech coming up or that's out that you'd like our listeners to go and check out?
First, I have a website. It's called Ken Spiro, KenSpiro.com. All my content is online there for free. You can listen, read, watch. I have a lot of classes and presentations. I've written a bunch of books. The best one I always say to start with is Crash Course in Jewish History. I have a YouTube channel. But most importantly, what I'm doing now is I'm doing a weekly podcast on current events in Jewish history. It's called Remember What's Next, and it's available on Apple, Spotify, Google, Anchor. So that's the thing that's most relevant material. It's coming out every week. So yeah, people are welcome to tune in and contact me through the website if they're interested.
Yeah, we're gonna put a link below of your podcast, your website, your books. So anyone who's watching or listening could easily access it, and I highly recommend. I've definitely been listening and attending your share now, I guess, at this point for years as like a secret admirer. So thank you so much for taking the time to do this, and we appreciate you. And I'm excited for the good that will come very soon.
Absolutely. And it should come soon and peacefully and quickly. Thank you very much for having me on the show.
Amen.
We should hear good news.
Amen. Thank you.
If you got this far in the episode, please leave in the comments the word brilliant. I love seeing your comments. Also, please let us know in the comment section if you agree with everything Rabbi Spiro said. I seriously see the world differently after attending his lectures. And of course, you should check out all that he does in the links below. Be sure to get your new threads at Twillory.com and use our code INSPIRE for $18 off. Call our friends at Bitbean to get your new idea to life. And you need a place in Israel? Contact our good friend AskTomer. You can reach him at AskTomer.com. And of course, he will find you the right place for you to purchase. And you can help someone who's dedicated to learn Torah and partake in the special reward. It's brilliant. Go to SmachZevulun.com to see more. Okay, now for our giveaway. The rules are simple. One lucky winner will get a $500 Amazon gift card. All you have to do is find an episode of Inspiration for the Nation that you love, share a link to it on your WhatsApp status or your Instagram story or Twitter, whichever social media you use, along with the reason why you enjoyed the episode. That's it. You're allowed up to 5 entries if you share 5 different episode links and what they meant to you. Once shared, please screenshot it and send your screenshot to our Living L'Chaim WhatsApp number, which is 914-222-5513, 914-222-5513. The contest is now live. You can see in the description below for more details. The winner will be drawn June 8th, so get your entries in. Good luck, and remember, inspiration is everywhere. L'chaim. Living L'chaim.